Hello and welcome to our Texas Tribune virtual symposium on the future of higher education. My name is Matthew Watkins and I am managing editor for news and politics at the Texas Tribune. I'm joined today by two chancellors of Texas University systems, Brian McCall and Ted Mitchell. Chancellor McCall is chancellor of the Texas State University system, comprising of 7 institutions with more than 86,000 students. A former member of the Texas House of Representatives, he has served on the board of the Legacy Texas Financial Group and is chairman of the Council of Public University Presidents and Chancellors. Chancellor Mitchell is chancellor of the Texas Tech University system, comprising of 4 institutions with approximately 55,000 students. He previously served as president of the Texas Tech Health Sciences Center and is president and CEO of the Cooper Clinic in Dallas. Thanks to both of y'all for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Chancellor Mitchell, I'd like to start with you. Your system offices and your flagship campuses are located in Lubbock, which right now, as we speak on Wednesday, October 21st, is one of the hottest spots in the state for the coronavirus. We've seen, kind of record hospitalizations in the region, far higher than they were in March, back when, the flagship university canceled classes for the semester. The governor's office has surged state resources to the region to handle the growing cases. But it looks like, from what I've been able to see, that positive cases on the Lubbock Texas Tech University campus are down from their earlier peak in the semester. How are things going right now? How is the process of trying to kind of run a campus during this pandemic working out for you guys?
Well, at the moment, things are stable. You're absolutely right. If you look at Lubbock as a town, Lubbock, Amarillo, El Paso, places where we have campuses are all big hotspots in Texas right now. And what's different in these most recent surges is, if you looked back at Memorial Weekend, you could kind of put a finger on what was going on. If you looked at Labor Day weekend, you could point out a finger at what was going on with students coming back in. Even in places like Amarillo with previous surges, you could pinpoint things like the meatpacking plants, the prisons, et cetera, et cetera. What's different with this one is it appears to be more from just the general increase in people moving and coming and going. And ironically enough, one of the safest places in Lubbock right now is our campus. And we have been really hitting hard communication to our students, staff, faculty, and the families of the students about the things they need to do to protect themselves with face masks, social distancing, avoiding crowded places, et cetera, et cetera. And to your point, Matthew, we've not had the resurgence of numbers on the campus. And so with that, our plan is to continue the same thing. And this is much like the other systems in the state, where we're trying to constantly communicate with our students. And the good news for us, kind of the blessing for us, is in our university system, we have 2 health relateds. So we have regular meetings with medical folks, trying to constantly watch the horizon about what's going on so that we can take tact as we need along the way to keep us safe.
Chancellor McCall, your flagship campus, Texas State University, has also seemed to be reporting some progress. I was looking on your website last night and saw that during the 4th week of class, the number of positive cases seemed to peak at around 115. By the 6th week, that number had dropped down to 31. What's happening right now? Is it the testing? What's helping you guys keep those numbers low?
Well, we are doing a lot of testing. That particular campus, which you called a flagship, we don't have a flagship in our system. We have 7 flagships in our system. But our largest campus has about half of the 40,000 students actually on campus. We've done what TED has done, what other systems have done, and making sure that those that do attend classes enter in an orderly way, exit in an orderly way, go through certain doors, masks, testing, cleanliness, all of those things. We'll spend about $90 million system-wide on testing and COVID-related costs. And it's working. Even though our enrollment is up, our COVID cases are flat and now going down. Thank God.
Chancellor Mitchell, how do you feel the quality of the education is being affected by this? Is it harder to administer the kind of instruction experiences that you hope your students will have, in college?
Well, Matthew, I think that probably the best word to describe it is it's just different. There are things about it that are positive. There are things about it that are negative. I think Dr. McCall can speak to this as well. It's one of those things that if you looked at Texas Tech, and I'll talk specifically about TTU as an example within the system about this, but about 20% of our semester credit hours prior to COVID were being delivered online already. So for a typical student taking 15 hours on campus, generally speaking, they'd have 12 hours face-to-face and 3 hours would be online. So they'd take an online stats class at night, things like that. So it wasn't something foreign to the students from the beginning. The difference was the magnitude of it. So, of course, when everybody went completely online in the spring, we had to spend, as did Dr. McCall at the Texas State System, a substantial amount of time, effort, and money to make it literally possible for these courses to be delivered completely online. And now what we've done, we've hit, and I don't know if our recent stats are, but it's about a third. About a third of our courses are now being delivered face-to-face, and that's primarily things in laboratories where you have to have face-to-face time. About a third is hybrid, where you have kids that are sometimes they're in class and sometimes they're live streaming, and then about a third is online. And so it's different. There are benefits that the students have being online that we could list out, but there's a downside to having things online as well. And I do think that if you looked at the trajectory of higher education in general, things more and more were moving to online in some format. And so I think what the COVID-19 situation has done is it's compressed it back to where it's all kind of right in front of us right now. On our Health Sciences Center side, we saw the same thing with telehealth. Telehealth is something that we've done for a long time. And if you extrapolated things down the road 10 years, it would probably have been done a lot more than it is. But because of COVID-19, it just compressed it all to where we're all doing it right now.
Sure. Do you agree with that, Chancellor McCall, about the trajectory? I mean, is this going to have a long-term effect, do you think, on how college educations are administered?
I think it will, because this is a profound period of change. We're learning from it. We're taking the best from it. And we will be able to deliver in a better way more information in a more compact period of time. I believe there will be good that comes from it. And already we're seeing those that stopped out, that didn't quite get a degree, are finding this is a good way to finish that credential.
Sure. Is it, we hear about this a lot with the K through 12 students, Chancellor Mitchell, about, when you're learning online, sometimes it can be harder to kind of keep in touch with your students, keep track of students. You worry about some students kind of, getting kind of lost in this system. And has there been any concern about, the downsides of missing face-to-face instruction, and, what can be done to kind of mitigate that challenge?
Well, Matthew, you're spot on about that. There is a downside that way, and that's probably, of all the issues with it, the greatest downside. Students, if you look at young people today, obviously they're much more adept at things that are online in general in the world that we're living in. However, one of the things that students get as part of a college experience is exactly what you just said: the capacity to have conversations back and forth, either with other students in a class or with a professor. And you do lose. There's some of that's lost in translation when you're trying to do things online. Now, we work within those limitations. Dr. McCall just said it. We're trying to say, or trying to learn from this, what are the things that we can extrapolate that are good things about this that we can really enhance? And then where are the big limitations? And we'll probably talk about this in a bit. One of the biggest limitations that we've run across with the online experience, limitations in broadband. And so for schools like ours, where we have a substantial percentage of students that live in rural areas, Ross Ramsey did a great piece back in April looking at the broadband issue in the state of Texas. So if you go to urban areas in urban deserts of broadband, if you look at lower socioeconomic students, and if you look at rural students, they're put at a disadvantage. If we're not very careful moving forward, they'll be put at a permanent disadvantage for lack of broadband.
Absolutely. It seems like there are students possibly you could reach that you hadn't before, Chancellor McCall, whether it's students who can't afford to travel to a campus out of town or things like that. And then there are the other students who maybe you're losing because of internet connectivity and things like that. How do you feel about where this is heading? This first semester has been a experiment in all of this. You had a little bit of time to prepare. We're coming up in this January season, hopefully getting a vaccine soon, but it was reported by the Tribune earlier this week that we can't expect, widespread vaccine availability until, the summer at the earliest, probably in Texas. What do you think about how the next semester is going to look like? Will it look much different than what the fall has been?
Well, we will continue to learn from what we've been through this fall, just as we learned from what we went through in the spring. Preliminary indications are that student participation will be up again, and I hope that is the case, barring some relapse of COVID. I'm so glad that Price and others in the legislature are doing what Dr. Mitchell pointed out needs doing, and what Ross Ramsey first drew attention to, and that is, our campuses are in Alpine, Del Rio, Eagle Pass, Uvalde, Beaumont, Orange, Port Arthur, and the students are from the outskirts of those places. So it's very important. At the beginning of this problem that we had last spring, students were running through their data plans in a week. We put data enhancers in parking lots so students could come to campus and sit in their cars and have access to internet. It's a significant problem, but I think we'll be in a better place then than we were the previous spring.
Very good. Chancellor Mitchell, I want to ask both of you, but I'll go to you first, Chancellor Mitchell, about the financial impact of this pandemic. Have you guys been able to get your arms around what this has meant and will mean financially to you as a system?
Well, obviously, it's one of those things that from one day to the next, you're kind of adding up all the bills, if you will. And one of the things that we've been working on actually for the last few years is making sure that within each one of our universities, within the various schools within those universities, that people were trying to put together their own rainy day fund, their own fund balances in schools in preparation for emergencies. And it just so happened that we were working pretty hard at that prior to the time this thing hit. But keep in mind, it was kind of this double whammy effect. On the one hand, there was a loss of revenue because as the students all had to go home, all the schools we had to refund them. It was only the right thing to do, refund them for their dormitories and the like. So you had this all of a sudden from one day to the next, a substantial loss in your revenue that you would normally have for your operations, while simultaneously then you had not just a continuation of the overhead that you had, but you actually had a significant increase in expenses for moving everything online. So that combination was problematic. I will tell you that when the CARES Act was passed and when the funds came available, both for the students as well as the universities, it was quite literally a godsend for most of the institutions of higher education around the state and around the country. We're still looking to see what the final costs are going to be. But thus far, we've been able to manage things. One of the things about a crisis like this from a financial perspective is it really does help you focus or perhaps refocus on those areas of greatest priority for you.
Chancellor McCall, are you experiencing a similar situation?
Well, everything Ted said, of course. And then some of our campuses, we're laying off administrators. We're cutting personnel. We're dipping into reserves. You've got to keep in mind that the bond payments for the dormitories continue, even though revenue doesn't come in for the dormitories. Same with food services. 3 of our 4 football teams are not playing because their conferences are not playing. So it's every aspect of the campus life and every aspect of revenue has been hit. We've took a $23 million cut because the state needed us to, and we get that and understand that we need to do those things, and we'll do what it takes. But The CARES funding, as Chancellor Mitchell said, was huge for us. And I want to give a shout out to Dr. Harrison Keller and his team at the coordinating board for the GEAR funds that he and the governor and the governor's office have found for us. So everyone is working together to make the best of a bad situation. And the thing that's amazing to me is system-wide, we've heard no complaining. People are doing what they didn't want to do. We loaded up 15,000 courses from in-person to online in the spring in a 2-week period or less, and there literally was no complaining. We get this as a pandemic. It's an unusual time. We'll get through it, and we'll be better for it on the other side.
Chancellor McCall, you know your way around the Texas State Capitol. We are getting closer to a legislative session. I know some of the kind of budgeting discussions, some of which have been a little bit disrupted by, the inability to meet in person and things like that. But this is around the time, where these conversations start happening. What are you expecting from the appropriations process early next year? And what is the message that you guys as chancellors are sending to the legislators about, how they should be thinking about higher ed during what should be a pretty difficult budget period, I would think?
Well, most things that the legislators must appropriate for are costs. Higher ed is an investment. It directly affects the economic output of the state, the communities where the institutions are, and it's a great investment. Different economists will give you different dollars of return for every dollar invested. So we're going to be pushing for keep the formula predictable. We're so lucky to live in a state with a predictable higher ed formula. It has been a number of years since we have done tuition revenue bonds, which are the bonds guaranteed by the state for building buildings. We're using our buildings at half capacity. In other words, it's going to take a classroom twice as big to serve half as many people if things don't change. And so it may seem ludicrous that I would talk about capital funding at this time, but Texas is continuing to grow. Interest rates have not been lower and won't be lower. It's an economic driver for the state, and higher ed is growing. I think 10% of the children in America are in Texas, and so we've got a pipeline where other states don't.
Chancellor Mitchell, there are a lot of things in the budget that are difficult to cut, and various things that the legislature can't cut. And higher ed is one I know that can sometimes suffer in those budgets seasons where excuse me, there's not a lot of spending to go around. What's the case that the universities should be making to the lawmakers to limit the damage to higher ed in the upcoming year?
And that's a great question. Chancellor McCall just hit the nail on the head. If you look at ROI for the state, educating people in institutions of higher education is a long-term investment for Texas. And I'll tell you, I'm a keep it simple kind of guy. If you look at the state budget like the face of a clock, from about 12 o'clock to 4:30 is all K through 12 public education. From about 4:30 up till close to 9 o'clock is all HHS. Higher ed is from about 8:30 till about 10 o'clock, and everything else is from 10 to 12. And if you look at public ed and health and human services, the needs in those two areas continue to get bigger every single session. So one of the things that we do is we work really hard to try to find other sources of income that are not related just to state funding, quite frankly, not related to federal funding either. Now, an advantage that we have is a health related that becomes more of a challenge for Chancellor McCall is that we have medical practice plans. And so those are things that we can try to work to help balance the books, if you will, on that. But our focus for the session then just becomes to step in and say, guys, the formula funding is kind of the bread and butter for everybody. And that's what we rely upon more than anything. As far as tuition revenue bonds, what we're doing with our TRB focus is taking older buildings we have to do things that we can refurbish things rather than just looking for new square footage, a new footprint with it. So we're trying to be as good stewards as we can of the funds that we have, while simultaneously going to the legislature to focus on the things that really does make up the bread and butter for higher education in general.
Chancellor Mitchell, I'd be remiss to have a conversation about higher ed in Texas without mentioning what Chancellor McCall mentioned earlier, which is that the athletic departments and college football in particular have been very much affected by this pandemic. College football in particular, a big moneymaker for Texas Tech University.
Sure.
We're seeing, some games being pushed back, and the games that are happening with far fewer, paying attendees, paying ticket holders in the stands.
Right.
I'd have to imagine that the athletics departments, particularly at Texas Tech, that you are largely expected, if not completely, to support themselves, are losing a lot of revenue through this. How is that going to affect things long term? I know that the fans would still like to see you guys spend money and be competitive in these sports.
Yeah, if you look at the NCAA Division I programs across the nation, I think that a lot of people would be surprised to know that relatively few are big money makers. If you look at the NCAA Division I programs, most of them, you're doing well just for the athletic departments to break even. And generally speaking, at most universities, the big driver is football. And football makes up the lion's share of the percentage of the overall athletic department. So as you said, when you look at modified schedules, when you look at modified attendance, 25% attendance, the bottom line has been impacted substantially. So as Dr. McCall mentioned, there have been reductions in force that you just simply could not get around because of that. And the hopes are to try to do everything that we can to play ball this season, football. I'm talking specifically now at Texas Tech. And as you know, the Big 12 has gone to a 9-1 season, 9 conference games and 1 non-conference game. But even with that, there's testing that is occurring every single week with the athletes. And so from one week to the next, literally, you may have a game that you say, well, we can't play this particular week. And every single weekend that you don't play, universities stand to lose millions of dollars. So it really is, at the end of the day, from an operational standpoint, not just from a spirit standpoint, but from an operational standpoint, it's a huge hit to everybody's bottom line.
Sure. Chancellor McCall, you mentioned 3 out of 4 football teams not even playing. Is same experience for y'all? Or is this? It's hard to cut expenses, right? Contracts and scholarships don't disappear when the games go away.
But the fans go away as well, even though one of our teams is playing. Texas State plays Brigham Young this Saturday, but it will be to a limited crowd, and it's just the participation is just not going to be there, and we get that. We understand that. At Sul Ross State University, a large percentage of our students go there because of athletics. We have a big football team, and it's a big outdoor place, and the majority of our students, when polled, say athletics was a big reason they chose Sul Ross. And so that has a dampening effect on the college experience in a significant way, not just monetary.
All right. Well, that, believe it or not, is our time. We flew through this 25 minutes. Chancellor McCall, Chancellor Mitchell, I very much appreciate your time and giving your insight on higher education at this time. And thank you to everyone who's been listening.
Thanks, Matthew. We'll see you soon, Matthew. Brian.